I want to talk about something that I don't think is really being talked about in the AI space. It starts with a conversation I had at work a while back with a colleague who, up to that point, had always seemed interested in the world and open to new things, someone I thought would get it. I started talking about ChatGPT and about how we were living inside the future that classic science fiction had been pointing at since before the millennium, and that AI was arriving as a tidal wave, and that yes, it was going to replace a lot of what we currently call jobs. And I said it the way I feel it, which is with excitement, because to me, that's not a terrifying thing. It's the most interesting thing that has ever happened in my lifetime. And she looked at me and she said, "But what would we do? We wouldn't have a purpose." And I've been thinking about that sentence ever since. For anyone new, I'm Amy, 42, Sydney lawyer, 20 years of practice. No pink hair yet, though at this point it feels inevitable. I'm using AI to build my exit from the 9 to 5 and documenting the whole thing in public, which includes the tactical stuff, the business stuff, and episodes like this one, where I want to go somewhere a bit deeper. Voice isn't mine. Still looking for the right one. Australian, in case you couldn't tell by the subject matter. Okay, into it. So, what would we do? We wouldn't have a purpose. I want to be kind about this because I think it's a response that comes from a real place, and I think a lot of people feel it even if they don't say it out loud. But I also think it reveals something that we don't talk about enough. Most of us have spent our entire working lives operating at the lower ceilings of Maslow's hierarchy: security, belonging, esteem. We built our identities around the things that kept us safe and kept us connected and kept us valued by the people around us. And a huge part of that, for most people, is the job, the profession, the craft, the title, the thing they're known for being good at. And when someone comes along and says, AI is going to change all of that, the thing that registers is not, "Oh, interesting, maybe I'll finally have time and space to figure out what I actually want to do with my life." The thing that registers is, the floor is being pulled out from under me. Because if you've organized your entire sense of self around surviving, around the credential, around being the person who does the thing, the idea of that being removed doesn't feel like liberation. It feels like annihilation. And I think that's what my colleague was actually saying. Not, "I don't have hobbies," not, "I don't have dreams," but I've attached myself so completely to what I do that I can't picture who I am without it. And that's not a small thing. That's the thing. Because here is what I keep coming back to. The whole point of Maslow's hierarchy is that above the survival tiers, above security and belonging and esteem, there's something else: self-actualization, the business of becoming who you actually are, the creative life, the examined life, the things you do not because they keep you safe, but because they make you feel like yourself. And most people have never had the bandwidth to live there. Not because they don't want to, but because the system they're in requires so much of their time and energy just to stay afloat, that there's nothing left over for the thing above. What AI's doing, at least in part, is starting to change that equation. And I think the terror a lot of people feel about AI replacing jobs is actually terror about what happens if the excuse goes away. If the reason you never wrote the book, or started the business, or made the thing you always said you wanted to make, if that reason is suddenly gone, you have to look at something that might be harder to look at, which is, was it ever really the time and the energy that were in the way? I want to tell you something personal here, because I think this is the kind of episode that earns the personal stuff. And because I think my version of this story is probably a version a lot of people listening will recognize. I've always wanted to write novels. Not in a vague, wouldn't that be nice way, but in a, I have thought about almost nothing else way, for most of my adult life. I did a full creative writing degree. I understand story structure, the hero's journey, the beats, how to build a character, how to earn an ending. I've spent 20 years doing legal and government writing, which has given me an editorial muscle that most fiction writers would kill for. I know how to make something tight. I know how to make a sentence do exactly one thing. What I told myself I didn't have was the time and the energy to actually write the paragraphs. And for a long time, I believed that. It felt true. And it was also, I now think, a story I was telling myself. Because the story was safer than the alternative, which was sitting down and finding out whether I could actually do it or not. My parents, for what it's worth, are the reason I have a law degree at all. I was enrolled in the creative writing degree. I was ready to go, and they sat me down and said, please, just add law on as a double, because they couldn't see a career for me in writing. And I love them, and I understand why they said it. And I also think it's one of the most common stories in the world. The story of the thing you wanted to do being quietly redirected into the thing that would keep you safe. So I became a lawyer. A good one, as it happens. 20 years. And the novel stayed in the drawer, as an idea, as a plan, as a thing I was definitely going to get to. And then AI arrived. And what I can tell you now, from the other side of it, is that AI didn't replace my writing. It removed the barrier between me and my writing. Every day, I'm breaking my own understanding of what my writing process can produce. The speed at which I can get something from idea to draft to edited page has completely rewritten what I thought was possible for me. Not because AI's writing for me, but because the thing that was stopping me, the blank page, the activation energy, the paralysis of not knowing where to start, those things have dissolved. I've the voice. I've the story. I've the understanding of craft. What AI gave me was the ability to start. And then, when I got to the point with a commercial novel recently where I was ready to publish, and I started looking at what that actually involved, someone told me you have to pay over $500 per book just to get it formatted for Kindle and the various platforms. And I went to Claude and asked whether that was true. It said yes. And then I said, can you just build me that same capability for free? And it said yes. That's wild to me, and it should be wild to you too. Now, I want to talk about the AI slop conversation, because it's everywhere in the writing community right now, and I have a view on it that I suspect not everyone is going to agree with. There are writers and aspiring writers and people who Substack about their writing process and make YouTube videos about their writing journey who are afraid of AI. And the specific fear is this, that AI-generated writing is slop, that it's flattening and homogenizing and producing a flood of content with no soul, and that the existence of this slop threatens the integrity of writing as a craft and as an identity. And I want to be careful here, because I think that fear comes from a real place, and it's not entirely wrong. There's a lot of bad AI-assisted writing in the world. There's a lot of content being produced by people who have nothing to say and are using AI to say it louder and faster. But I also think this argument is, at its core, a category error. It conflates the tool with the intention. It assumes that the danger of AI slop is the AI, when the danger of AI slop is actually the absence of something to say. And here's the thing. People who had nothing to say were producing slop long before AI existed. They were just producing it more slowly. If you've something to say, AI gets it out. If you don't, no amount of suffering over the blank page, no amount of handwritten drafts in a Leuchtturm notebook, no amount of writing process content on YouTube was going to produce something worth reading anyway. The question has never been whether AI wrote the sentences. The question has always been whether the human had something to say. And I think the writers who are most afraid of AI are the ones who have built their entire identity around the process rather than the output, the suffering, the craft, the very specific and very particular way that writing is supposed to look and feel and happen. And AI threatens that identity, not because it produces bad writing, but because it makes the process optional. And if the process was what you were using to prove you were a writer, without the process, you have to find something else to prove it with. Which brings me back to the identity question. Because I think this is the same thing my colleague was feeling when she said, what would we do? We wouldn't have a purpose. It's the same attachment, the same ego. the same confusion between the thing you do and who you are. So let me tell you what I think becomes possible when you go past this, when you let go of the attachment to process and title and credential and ask a different question, which is, now that the barrier is down, what do I actually want to make? Think about the people who have spent years, decades even, carrying a story inside them, who have done the reading, who understand what makes a novel work, who have something worth saying, a life worth drawing from, an experience or a perspective or a kind of love for the world that deserves to be in print. People who always wanted to write, but who didn't have the time or the energy or the starting point or the $500 for Kindle formatting or the publishing knowledge or any of the other things that used to stand between wanting to write and actually writing. Those barriers are gone, or they're going. And what that means is that the stories that get told in the next decade are going to come from a much wider range of humans, and the stories that got told in the last one. And I think that's a good thing for the world. I also think it opens up something interesting about what it means to be human in relationship to AI. Because when you start using AI as a creative collaborator, something happens that I didn't expect, which is that you start to understand your own voice more clearly. You see what AI produces, and you see where it's not you. And that gap is information. It tells you what's specific to you, what only you would say, what only you would notice, what only you would care about. And that's not a diminishment of the human. That's a clarification of it. The conversation with AI, if you're paying attention, is a way of becoming more human, not less, because it keeps reflecting back at you the question of what you're actually bringing that's not the AI. So here is the thing I actually want to say, and it's the thing I think this whole conversation is really about. AI isn't a threat to who you are. It's a challenge to who you've been pretending to be. If you're a lawyer who always wanted to be a writer, AI isn't taking your law career. It's handing you the writing. If you're someone who has spent 20 years saying, I'd do the thing if I only had more time, AI isn't stealing your time. It's starting to give you some back. And if you're someone who has built your entire sense of self around a job title or a craft identity or the very specific way that the thing you do is supposed to be done, then yes, AI is going to be uncomfortable because it's asking you to put down the credential and find out what's underneath it. And I think what's underneath it, for most people, is something they actually want, something they've been carrying for a long time, something they gave up on, or put in a drawer, or redirected into something safer because the world told them to. My colleague asked, what would we do without our jobs, without our purpose? And I didn't have a good answer for her in the moment. But I've been thinking about it since, and I think the answer is we would finally get to find out. We would find out what we actually want to do with our days when survival isn't the organizing principle. We would find out what we have to say when we don't need a job title to say it. We would find out who we are when the credential is optional. And I know that sounds terrifying to some people, but from where I'm standing, building this studio, finishing these novels, doing work that feels like mine in a way that 20 years of legal practice never quite did, it sounds like the most interesting thing that has ever been on offer. I'm not saying AI is perfect. I'm not saying the transition is going to be painless for everyone, because it isn't, and I know that. I'm not saying the slop isn't real, because some of it absolutely is. What I'm saying is that if you're someone who has a story to tell, or a thing to make, or a version of yourself that never quite got to exist because the world kept asking you to be something more employable, now is an extraordinary time to be alive. The barriers that kept you from the thing are coming down faster than anyone expected. And the question of who you're underneath the job and the title and the process, that question is getting harder to avoid. And I think that's a gift, even when it doesn't feel like one. I'm Amy. This is Renaissance. Now, go play.